Salam sejahtera, salam bangsa Malaysia kepada semua rakan-rakan. Terima kasih kerana bersama kita pada malam ini. Good evening everyone, thanks so much for joining us. Siri Dialog Bangsa Malaysia on foreign policy. I'm really delighted this evening to be joined by a really cool panel. My name is Nathaniel Tan. I work with Project Bangsa Malaysia, and let me introduce our great panel this evening. We have Dr. Cheng-Chwee, who's an Associate Professor and Head of the Center for Asian Studies at UKM's Institute of Malaysian and International Studies, ICMAS. We have Ms. Elena Noor, who's the Director of Political and Security Affairs and the Deputy Director of the Washington, D.C. office of the Asia Society Policy Institute. Very cool. We have Thomas Daniel, who's a Senior Fellow in the Foreign Policy and Security Studies Program at ISIS Malaysia. And we have Dr. Zulkifli Idris, Director of External Relations with Ideas Malaysia. Thanks so very much for joining us, guys. Very cool, very cool. Okay, so for Siri Dialog Bangsa Malaysia, kalau Rakyat jadi Menteri series, we basically talk to policy experts. Malaysian policies we find have a tendency to be done very much with political interests in mind, sometimes with tauke interests in mind, informed by not always the best factors. So we decided to go, to experts, to people who really know their stuff, and try to find out how they would shape Malaysian policies. For foreign policy and for all the policies in this series, we start with a bit of a historical overview. Maybe for the first round, our panelists, can 4 or 5 minutes talk to us a little bit give us an overview of Malaysian foreign policy over the years, over the decades. What have been some of the major themes, some of the biggest successes, the biggest failures, the big turning points, things like that. Maybe you can start us off with a bit of a brief overview, if that's okay. Maybe I will start Ms. Thomas, if that's okay.
Sure, absolutely okay. Let me structure, and thanks for having me, Nat. It's a privilege to be here with part of a really distinguished panel. Let me keep my remarks, start off with just 2 points, really. First, about Malaysian foreign policy, and second, maybe I would like to address one of the successes, I think, of Malaysian foreign policy. So, one of the most interesting and the most fundamental aspects of Malaysian foreign policy is this adherence to it, is ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and how it features so much in Malaysian foreign policy. So, if you go to Wisma Putra's website and if you read some of the foundations and the tunggak of Malaysian foreign policy, it says there that ASEAN remains the cornerstone of Malaysian foreign policy. And I think a couple of years ago, someone proposed that ASEAN should be a cornerstone of Malaysian foreign policy, and that sort of set off upset a few people within the establishment, because it really shows the extent of how much ASEAN features in Malaysian foreign policy. ASEAN is a very important regional organization that has evolved into its own community. Malaysia is a founding member of ASEAN, and in fact, some would argue that it was because of Malaysia and the confrontasi that we had with Indonesia and the Philippines, which ultimately led to the formation of ASEAN. So an organization that was founded out, back then, so that the leaders of the Southeast Asian countries could work out issues, could sort of cooperate, and to avoid sort of conflicts bursting out into incidences like the confrontasi. However, again, ASEAN has evolved. It's now a community. There is a economic community, there is a political security community, there is a social-cultural community. It has grown from initially 5 members to 6 and now to 10. But a lot of the foundations of ASEAN ultimately remains the same. A lot of ASEAN is rooted in the sort of well, I would use the word shackles that shaped it in the 70s. And the question now that Malaysia and other ASEAN member countries are facing is whether ASEAN is equipped to deal with the challenges that we are facing now. This is one particular aspect of Malaysian foreign policy that I think is extremely important to understand. We invest a lot in ASEAN. We look at ASEAN as a very significant player in this region. We engage, when we engage in our foreign policy, we don't just do it bilaterally, but oftentimes we engage through ASEAN and with other ASEAN members. If I can just quickly speak about a success in Malaysian foreign policy. This was a very interesting conversation I had with a colleague at ISIS some time ago, and it's really a symbolism of Malaysian contribution. Back in the 90s, I think Malaysia actually contributed quite heavily to the eventual definition of what sustainable development would be. Malaysia was a player that argued for the inclusion of tangible economic development and a guarantee to livelihoods in the eventual definition of what is sustainable development, because it was previous to that, it was just environmental sustainability. And I think because of the Malaysian leadership in pushing for that back then, we were given the honor of being the first chair at the Commission of Sustainable Development back in the 90s. That doesn't exist anymore. It's grown into a high-level political forum on sustainable development. And Malaysia also led the Intergovernmental Platform on Diversity and Ecosystem more recently. I think, but there is a reason for that. We were criticized for excessive logging in the 80s, and that sort of pushed Malaysia to sort of take sustainable development a bit more seriously and to move in that direction. I think the culmination of that was in the Rio Earth Summit, where Mahathir, vintage Mahathir, right? He gives this speech where he bashes the rich and the developed countries for pressuring developing countries, and then he commits Malaysia to keeping 50% of its forest cover for perpetuity. So of course, some of my colleagues will also say we need to look at exactly what part of the forest that we have committed. Is it just forest cover or just forest? Because both mean two different things entirely if you look down at it. But I think I will sort of end my remarks here and leave it to my colleagues to share.
Thanks very much, Thomas. Thank you. So ASEAN as a big part of Malaysian foreign policy. Hopefully we can go into this a little bit later on this evening. I'm sure with that different views. Some people look at ASEAN as a big success. I imagine some people look at it as a bit of a lame duck failure kind of thing. It'll be interesting to see the differing views on this. Thank you very much, Thomas. Let's go to Elena. If you could give us some thoughts on your overview, big picture, major successes, failures. We're all ears.
Yeah, so thank you for having me. It's great to be with friends. So let me start off with kind of a big picture overview of where we are today and how we got here. I think if you look through the decades since Merdeka, what you'll see is that our foreign policy has always been fairly consistent. It's always been principled on certain values and norms, and we've always attributed this rhetorically, but also I think we've also done a good job trying to exemplify this in practice. And so international law, principles of international law, cooperation, peace and stability, these have all been standard mantras of our foreign policy throughout the decades. Initially, when we first became independent, we, I think, naturally leaned a little west. But over the years, we found our footing somewhat as an independent country, and we've sought to maintain that independence in our foreign policy with some tweaks in our approaches over the decades. And I think you've seen this particularly in our outlook towards the Middle East with various administrations, depending on who is leading the government. You've also seen this in our handling of major power relations, primarily the US and China. But we've always sought to navigate between these different axes in the international sphere. And as Thomas has said, we've done that through ASEAN at the regional level, but we've also put very high regard on the UN system. And Malaysia has campaigned for reform of the UN Security Council, somewhat unsuccessfully, unfortunately, till now. But our goal has always been to try to raise the agency of smaller countries like Malaysia that are independent in our foreign policy. So apart from ASEAN and the UN, you also have had some activism, particularly during the Mother years of the non-aligned movements, South-South cooperation. And I think on reflection, as I was growing up, I didn't really see these initiatives as anything impactful or meaningful. But I think maybe this comes with age. I think maybe we need to revisit some of these ideas and give new life to them, particularly as we're being squeezed because of major power competition right now between the US and China. And I'm sure we'll go into this a little more, but I thought I'd just provide that overview.
Thanks very much, Lina. It's interesting. You talk about growing up. I also remember, I think when I was in school, I learned about NAM and I learned about a South-South initiative. And but these things are a bit old. They don't seem to be, I don't know whether they fizzled out. But when there was a time where, we used to talk about this great Southern solidarity and things like that. Yeah, I wonder whether we can bring back those days and that relevance. And you also mentioned consistency, which I suppose, it is a bit of a theme, maybe slightly more than other policy areas in Malaysia, which, kind of go quite a bit and have a bigger range. Maybe in terms of foreign policy, we've been a little bit more, not so wild and all over the place. But thanks very much. We'll come and look into those things again. Thank you. Cheng-Chwee, love to hear your thoughts on the overview.
Thanks very much, Nat, for having us here. It's wonderful to be with friends like Elena, Thomas, and also Dr. Zokri. And just to pick up and to build on the big picture observations that Elena has laid out so well, and also to relate back to a lot of points that, good points that Thomas has mentioned about ASEAN and all that. You talk about, Nat, you relate to Elena's earlier observation by talking about the word consistency. And I guess I will share my observations, a few points based on that particular word, which clearly it's important not just for Malaysian foreign policy, but I guess for foreign policy, external policy for all countries in the world, big and small. As a student, not just as a Rakyat, but as a student of international relations, I would like to interpret the word consistency in foreign policy, not just in terms of consistency in safeguarding our national interests, sovereignty, prosperity, autonomy, that sort of things, but also consistency in terms of upholding our principles. But I would like to also emphasize and also clarify the word consistency, and that's perhaps different from the understanding from many people out there, is that consistency doesn't mean that we will always stick to our original formula. When a situation change, clearly we have to adapt accordingly. And that's in a way to address your earlier invitation to talk about whether success or lack of it. I think Malaysia's foreign policy, in my view, again, as an academic, is that I think we have been tried very hard. We have never taken national interest and also survival as a small state for granted. And you do see that throughout our history, when external internal conditions change, you do see our foreign policy change accordingly. Just take one example that, and this is something that again, many Malaysians, especially young or younger generation, overlook. I think when we talk to many Malaysians about Malaysian foreign policy, if I ask them to talk about 1 or 3 words, non-alignment would be come out very prominently. And many assume that non-alignment has always been Malaysia's foreign policy. And I told them, actually, that's not true. For the first 14 years of Malaysia's nationhood, when we obtained independence from 1957 until 1971, our foreign policy is not one of non-alignment. Our foreign policy, it's what Elena mentioned earlier on, we actually aligned very closely with the West. In fact, we were in an alliance, and that's in the form of Malaysia, the Anglo-Malayan Defense Agreement. So it's a bilateral alliance. So we joined non-alignment only towards the late 1960s when external conditions changed. When British talk about, they announced the East of Suez, right? They have to retreat because of their domestic problems at home. And around the same time also, US announced the Nixon Doctrine that they were retreating because of the setback in Vietnam, the Vietnam War. They were retreating from mainland Southeast Asia. So there was a kind of a turning point for Malaysia and also other smaller countries in the region. We are not alone. And that in a way coincided with the formation of ASEAN in 1967. So when those conditions externally change in a drastic way, you do see that we try to be persistent, consistent by upholding our national interests, but by adjusting our external policy from one of alliance to one of non-alignment, but also regionalism. I think Thomas' example make it very well. So ASEAN became our cornerstone actually only after the end of AMDAR and when we have started to embrace non-alignment. So non-alignment, regionalism, multilateralism at global and regional level, all these are kind of our new focus from 1970s onwards. And the way I think Malaysian foreign policy makers and leaders see it is that we are not seeing one over the other. All these different approaches, ASEAN, neighboring countries, big powers, near and far, all those we need to see them as like there are tools in our toolbox, right? We are a smaller country, resources are very limited, options are very limited, but precisely for that reason, for survival reason, we need to work harder than anyone. And that exactly means that we need to be very, very active in trying to, number one, adjust our policy whenever is necessary. From alliance to non-alignment, that's one. And also adding layers of regionalism and multilateralism, that is also another adjustment. Right? And you do see that this is something that, again, I think Malaysia has done so much, but it's either neglected or forgotten by many people, either in our profession or Rakyat Malaysia in general. For example, it's not just the ASEAN regionalism, but also regionalism in terms of East Asia, something that, again, Malaysia has done so much in terms of forging kind of collective identity and also actions within not just among Southeast Asia, but also Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia, China, Japan, and South Korea. And these are the things that happen when, again, external changes occurred in when Cold War ended and we move into post-Cold War era and also economic globalization. So Malaysia has taken all these adjustment initiatives. And in that extent, I think Rakyat Malaysia in general, and especially a younger generation, perhaps we should have this kind of interactions to actually think further. What kind of things that we have done, and in future, what are the things that we can move into? I will stop here.
Thanks very much, Cheng-Chwee. Very enlightening. So yes, when you talk about consistency of principle rather than consistency of policy or consistency of alignment, this is of course something that's relevant. Not just in foreign policy, there's a kind of adherence to principle that we aspire to in various layers of democracy as well, and daily life even. But yeah, there's a good historical review, good reminder, and of course, the term non-aligned, I suppose, is a Cold War legacy. No, it's a slightly different role from them. But thank you. It's quite a comprehensive overview. Very, very helpful. Thank you. Zukri, if you could give us a similar overview, your thoughts. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Project Bangsa Malaysia, for having me, as well as having my friends to be here. The perks of being the last speaker at the first round is that you'll just sum out all the points by the previous speaker and probably try to refurbish it in a way. I'll talk a bit on the consistency in a while, but I think I'll probably start my observations by taking a stand that the foreign policy should not be based on whether it's a success or a failure. I would not go onto that spectrum. Rather, I would probably evaluate the foreign policy in terms of the innovativeness that happens in that particular era, or either that foreign policy has been stagnant. And we have seen the trajectory of the Malaysian policies as just like that. When the Prime Minister Datuk Sri Dr. Mahathir back then as the first time as a Prime Minister, we've seen from 1982 until 2002, our foreign policy is quite aggressive. We have been very vocal. I think some of the examples have been said before. We are very vocal towards the Palestinian apartheid issue, as well as the unfairness of the Western or the first world countries to the third world countries. So that is actually seen throughout that kind of leadership. But from 2002 and onwards, we've seen it is a bit stagnant. There is not much innovation that can be identified throughout this era. And again, when 2018, Tun Mahathir VM as the second time of the Prime Minister, we've seen there is a changes. This is when Wisma Putra published the new foreign policy framework under the banner of change and continuity. There was also the moment where we had the military white paper, the defense white paper produced during the Pakatan Harapan era. So we've seen the trajectory of the foreign policy is either that it's been innovative or aggressive in a sense, or rather than it's just been stagnant and following the status quo. And my hypothesis is this: it depends on the willingness as well as the voluntariness of the Prime Minister as the head of state. Where does the Prime Minister would like to bring the nation in the realm of international order? And it's been consistently during the Tun Mahathir's time that this is where we've seen a lot of initiatives and a lot of foreign policies has been crafted. Now, again, what Dr. Quick says on consistency is something that I did not really register consistency that before. But again, when we look into the foreign policy framework, change in continuity, on the overall picture of that framework, it seems that Malaysia is just following the normal practices. We remain as the non-aligned movement. We've been independent. We are a friendly country. We have our opinion. We protest when we want to, as well as we steadfast to our values. So these are actually not something new in 2018, but it's an accumulation of practices and norms that Malaysia has established since that we gained independence. So it's just that the government repackaged it. But again, I would argue that this is something better than nothing. You know, it's something that is there is a blueprint, there is a framework, and that is something that all minor policies has to follow. And I also think that the creations of that kind of foreign policies is also could be married with how we envisioned ourselves as a nation. Where do we see ourselves in the future, and how does actually the foreign policy reacts to it? Again, for example, during Tun Mahathir's time that we have this vision 2020, everyone envisions what life would be in the year of 2020. Again, we're not going to judge what is the thing that really happened in 2020. We are imagining all these kinds of things, suddenly COVID happens. But the point is, when I was growing up, you know, we had these kinds of envision, we had these kinds of dream, this kind of imagination that our country will prosper by 2020, and that any foreign policies will just react to that. Similarly, Malaysia had this Transformasi Nasional 2050. Again, it is where we envision ourselves as a nation, as a Malaysian in the year of 2050. And that is also where the transformation plan happens at a big scale of a national development agenda. So again, my observation is the projection of Malaysian foreign policy is actually dependent on the vision of our country. Where do we see ourselves heading towards to, and what are the preparations that needs to be made? What are the mechanisms? What are the variables or deliverables that is being manifested by the Malaysian foreign policy? As long as we do not have a clear vision of our country, then I probably will suspect the projection of Malaysian foreign policy will be stagnant. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I do think that the only innovations that I can probably see is in 2018, where we have the national foreign policy on between change and continuity, as well as the defense white paper. Of course, Wisma Putra had produced a lot of joint statement and press statement between countries. That's fine. But again, we are looking at the blueprint. So I think I'll stop there. My argument is that the thing that I probably want to raise is that the Malaysian foreign policy is not really about failure or success, but it is actually whether it's innovative enough or whether it's been stagnant enough. And whether it's innovative or stagnant depends the visions that we have for our country, Malaysia.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Zokri. It's quite interesting. So instead of using good or bad, we use aggressive, innovative, or stagnant. That's an interesting dichotomy. And you know, I think you pointed out the you know, of course, and there's no such thing as 100% dichotomy between foreign and domestic policy. These things are always interrelated. I think your points also bring up the importance of leadership, Tun Mahathir is an extremely controversial figure. I've got very strong opinions myself, but I think that no one can argue that he left a mark in his first 20 years of premiership. He pursued some things very aggressively and made a name for Malaysia, good and bad, on the world stage. So, and I think we've not really seen anything like that since. You talk about innovativeness, aggressiveness versus status quo. It seems like the rest of the administration seemed a little bit more status quo. Okay, second round. I hope you don't mind, just for ease and to give me less setting. I'll just follow the same order. It's just easier and fairer. Hope you don't mind. I guess maybe just playing it by ear a little bit. Maybe we'll go an expanding size. Maybe now we'll talk a little bit more about ASEAN, and a little bit more later we can talk about the global stage. And I know each of you have sort of like different areas of interest and different sort of like aspects of ASEAN maybe that you can expand on. If I'm not mistaken, Thomas, you do quite a bit of work on refugees, if I'm correct.
A little bit, yeah. I sort of looked at refugee policy in Malaysia.
Yeah. So I mean that's something close to my heart a little bit. It's a huge thing. The domestic attitudes towards migrants and refugees is and of course when we're doing this Bangsa Malaysia thing, some people take it an excuse to be xenophobic and or if you're not Malaysian then But on one of our other Bangsa Malaysia dialogues was the Mahasiswa dialogue. This young kid is telling us, the best way to be a good Malaysian is to be a good human. So we were like, oh wise kid there. Left quite an impression on me. But it seems obviously for some of us, I mean I understand there's a diversity of views on this, and we can respect the diversity of views, but I'm personally interested in more compassionate takes and trying to have a humane policy towards refugees. But I myself also, when I look at the big picture, the question of we do get quite a lot of people trying to come into the country, right, and who don't really want to go back. I mean, if you're looking at Myanmar, looking at Rohingya and things like that, if I were them, I wouldn't want to go back either, right? But if you just have a constant influx also, it doesn't seem like a very sustainable policy, And then we had this controversy some months ago about suddenly we sent a whole bunch of people back to Myanmar when the junta took over, and that was really strange and disturbing and things like that, But it's a very complex issue, right? And if a purely humane, just like everybody just come and we'll take care of you approach is probably too far on one end of the spectrum to be practical. So I'm definitely interested to hear, your thoughts about longer term diplomatic solutions to this. What kind of things may work? It's a very difficult. It seems quite intractable. But what's sorry, that's me talking too long. You tell us what we should do.
Well, okay, that's a super wide topic, but maybe let me just sort of skew it down to perhaps one point on ASEAN and then one more on Malaysia. So the issue in ASEAN is that there is recognition that sort of there are issues in ASEAN member states that lead to the forced displacement of their citizens. Now, this is primarily now centered around Myanmar. There is agreement that there is forced displacement, but the response on the sort of institutional response on how to deal with that is much more fractured. Ultimately, this is where ASEAN's status as an association of 10 member states with 10 different national interests comes into play. Not everyone looks at the issue with the same amount of severity as, let's say, Malaysia does or Indonesia does, and we look at it as an issue of severity because we are states in proximity, and we get we host a number of these displaced individuals. Thailand hosts a large number of displaced people from Myanmar, as does Bangladesh. Although political realities in Thailand sort of differentiates how the government chooses to engage with it. There is a lot of roadblocks in ASEAN on sort of tangible actual solutions on what can be done. There is differences in how to engage Myanmar on this particular issue there, and in Myanmar itself, there is a varying degrees of responses on how they deal efforts to engage them. For example, when it comes to certain refugees, the Chin, the Karen, the Kachin, the Kayan, there is a recognition that these people are from Myanmar and they are displaced and therefore are entitled to resettlement back home once the peace process is signed and so on. And that has been happening at least until the peace process went up in smoke again. But with the Rohingya, for example, there is absolutely zero recognition by the Burmese government, the civilian government and the military government, that the Rohingya are Burmese, that they are citizens of Myanmar. They consider this group of people to be largely external illegal migrants who cross the border from Bangladesh. And there is, conversations on getting them to resettle the Rohingya back or to work towards a political solution has always, at least till date, been stalled by their side. So it's a bit of a challenge, really, and it's one of those really very wicked problems with sort of very few good solutions in the short term. So that leads me to the other point about Malaysia and Malaysian issues dealing with refugees and asylum seekers. My former colleague Aryan coined the term that our refugee policy is to not have a policy, and for a very long time that was what we adopted. But some things have changed now. For example, Malaysia used to be a transit country. That's changed, especially with the Rohingya. For the Rohingya, Malaysia is a destination country, for better or for worse. When I started doing this work a few years ago, there seemed to be no recognition of that among policymakers. Now that has changed. They do recognize that, but unfortunately, the responses has always been very securitized and more securitized when it comes to dealing with them. What I see is the fundamental challenge here is that there is too big a gap between those, between the bureaucrats, the civil service, and those who adopt a very harsh, securitized, cannot give an inch, because the moment we do, the orang semua akan masuk, you have no idea what is out there. I mean, these are the arguments that I've heard. I'm not discounting them because there is a degree of truth, but unfortunately, Malaysia we need to realize that the realities of the situation now is as such, whereas we are a destination country, and we have our choice needs to be how we are going to react to this. Do we continue to close off? Do we continue to drive off boats and to let people die on the sea, as we had been doing? Are we prepared to sort of be called out for going against the principles of non-refoulement? I mean, these are very real questions, and there are policymakers, unfortunately, who are very prepared to do this. And these are some of the tough choices that we must face. The other end of this problem is that those who advocate on behalf of refugees and asylum seekers, unfortunately, some of them come too far from the left. So there is very little middle ground. There's the folks who believe that that we need to securitize, that we need to shut down, we need to push back, we need to have this wall, for example. And those who believe that we need to accept them all in, we need to take them all in, we need to care for them. There is very little middle ground, and people are not talking to each other, they're talking at each other. And unfortunately, the ones who really kena the side effects, the real effects, are those who are displaced, those who intend to come to this country, and those who are already here, unfortunately. So let me just end it with this little anecdote. A couple of years ago, Malaysia used to have some of the highest resettlement rates of refugees under the UNHCR. We used to resettle about 10,000 to 12,000 people a year, which was actually one of the highest rates for UNHCR. So two things happened that changed that. One was the then Trump administration. So when Donald Trump became president, he cut the American acceptance of UNHCR refugees drastically. That took off a huge chunk of how many refugees we were able to resettle to the United States. The second bit is obviously the pandemic, which has stopped resettlement even further. So this is going to be a problem that we have to, a challenge that we have to learn how to manage. The question is whether we can do this compassionately, but at the same time not excluding very legitimate national interests. I don't know if there is an answer to that, and I can see these things because I don't have to make those decisions. But it is these are the difficult conversations that we need to have
Thanks very much, Thomas. A bit disappointed. I was hoping you'd tell us the answer. You're just telling us very hard to find answer. How like that? Just kidding.
Oh no, lah. If I tell you guys the answer, then I won't have a job anymore. So I need to perpetuate now. I'm just kidding.
Thanks, Thomas. Yeah, I mean, I can definitely relate to, like, two extreme ends talking at each other instead of talking to each other. Again, this is a problem that's replicated in various aspects of Malaysian society. But yeah, it's interesting. At least pandemic is no end in sight. But at least Trump is out of office, so I don't know whether that might bring up resettlement rates again. But yeah, it's definitely no obvious solutions. If there were obvious solutions, I guess somebody would have figured it out by now. But it's a very deeply polarizing issue. Yeah, it's a tough one. Maybe the rest of our team here got better ideas on that. Please feel free to jump in anytime at your turn. It's one that's been, it gnaws at me. How do we solve this problem? And yeah, tonight I would love to. Definitely open to ideas. Okay. Again, when I got the speaker blurbs, I saw that Thomas knew a little bit about refugees, so I decided to bully him a little bit on that. But the rest of you, I don't know your research. Your work so well, so you're gonna have to just, whatever you like to talk about ASEAN, please feel free. Whichever area you know best. Very sorry, I didn't, a bit behind on my homework. But Elena, you're up next. I don't know whether security staff or whatever you feel best suited. Regionalism, regional dynamics. Please feel free.
Since you gave us license, can I talk about unicorns and fairies and foreign policy?
Please, by all means.
So, okay, I actually want to pick up on what Zokri mentioned, this idea of innovating aggressively or assertively, whatever the adjective is or verb is that you want to use. And I think this is key because what we've seen in the ASEAN region is this enthusiasm, and I would say over-enthusiasm sometimes, without over-enthusiasm for anything digital. Digitalization is great. It will bring us great wealth, great prosperity, and the economic pie will be enlarged. There is no complementary and sufficient discussion, I feel, at this point in time about the risks and challenges of everything digital. And this is where there lies an opportunity, which is right now a sort of a weakness of our foreign policy in a lack of innovating our thought leadership in contributing to the discussions around tech and digitalization. Some of our neighbors in the region have really taken this thought leadership and run off with it, put money behind it, built up a whole capacity building initiative with tens of millions of dollars. We in Malaysia have this capacity. We're not capitalizing on it. So while we talk about the digital economy, I remember when I was working at ISIS Malaysia many moons ago, we were talking about the K economy, the knowledge economy. And this was in the early 2000s. That has sort of dropped off the cliff for whatever reason. But now we're all excited and exuberant about what the promises of the digital economy will bring. We have not had a conversation about what bias and discrimination in algorithms imported from abroad may do to our social context. We are already a fractured society as it is. If we import these algorithms without knowing how they're designed, how they're constructed, who is behind all of this thinking, and we blindly execute these algorithms into our systems without having sufficient consideration for minority communities in Malaysia, for women, for children, for the Orang Asli community, if they can even have access to any of this tech. These are conversations that we should be having instead of talking about, the digital sphere, digital banking, and what large companies, mainly MNCs, will do for our economy. So we're very, very gung-ho about investment opportunities. We were so disheartened. I saw all this conversation on social media about when Facebook and Google decided not to route their submarine cables through Malaysia. Where was the discussion on the security implications of that routing of submarine cables? We know it's documented in open source that there are surveillance benefits for some of these countries behind these projects. that are not advantageous to us. I think we should have a more open conversation about this, but that stems from greater awareness. And so let me just say that in Malaysia, we've had experts who've represented our country at the UN level, at the ASEAN level, to talk about some of these norms and rules of behavior that should govern tech and emerging tech in cyberspace. Unfortunately, going back to what Zuhri said, there's been this stagnation in ideas, probably because of our political situation back home. There hasn't been much priority or resources directed to some of these things that we should be talking about. So if we can get our act together back home, because foreign policy is really an extension of domestic policy, then we can start being innovative in the international stage. Unfortunately, sorry again, Nat, this might be a depressing conversation by the end of the night, but I don't see that happening anytime soon in the next couple of years. But maybe with your project, we can get something going. I think it starts with awareness.
Thank you, Lina. Yeah, I mean, thought leadership, regional thought leadership, and yeah, we do see people just rushing. Digital is like a hype, like a fad, right? Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, and then I personally think Malaysia is some of the smartest, most entrepreneurial people in the world, but we seem to be held down by the men, as it were. Can't even keep our people from dying at the moment, so don't need to talk about all the other stuff. But actually, I forgot, sorry, since again, maybe this round we'll talk a little bit about ASEAN. One of the more general, for Thomas, I had a very specific question because of his area of expertise, but a more general question, is this generally been an effective platform? I'm pretty sure I've seen people say like, this ASEAN, it's just a lame duck, and everyone's just, don't interfere in my internal affairs, and so there's no human rights, all this kind of thing, but some people seem to think it is very successful. Maybe before we go to the rest, Alina, do you have quick thoughts on that?
Sorry, I didn't do a good enough job about connecting it back to ASEAN.
Oh, it's okay. I just wanted to ask the question so that with the other trio. So yeah.
So my quick thought is this: I am a fervent supporter of ASEAN. I am also a very strong critic of ASEAN, and I am a strong critic because I'm a fervent supporter of ASEAN. I think we've come very far as a regional organization, as a community, given our really, really very severe differences. You look at the history of ASEAN, each of the separate 10 member states, and you look at our foreign policy positions even till today, towards the United States, towards China. Contrast our position with the Philippines, for example, contrast ours with Singapore, ours with Thailand, and you'll see that it's a miracle that we even get any consensus whatsoever at any meeting. So I think this point is often lost in translation, particularly to the outside world. But we can do so much better on topical issues like refugees, as Thomas has been talking about, like human rights, that is suited to our regional context, not just merely imported from abroad. And we can do so much more to just even raise awareness about what ASEAN is to the regular person on the street. I think if you ask any Malaysian on the ground, whether they really know about ASEAN, whether they've heard of ASEAN, chances are 50-50 that, some of them will say yes and some of them will say, So
thanks. Thank you very much. Very insightful. Thomas, you got your hand up real quick.
Sorry, thanks. Very great. Just to build up on what Alina said, I think it's also imperative for us to actually educate folks on what ASEAN isn't, and what we should not, and what a lot of people look at ASEAN and people think of the EU. That's absolutely not what ASEAN is, and maybe not what it should be. So I think that there needs to be this sort of very clear articulation on what ASEAN is, what it isn't, what it can do, what it wants to do, and what it needs to change to get to do what it wants to do. Sorry, last anecdote. I think a former SecGen of ASEAN, who was a Malaysian, he loves the saying about you need to look at ASEAN in terms of decades. If you look at it in terms of what it does by years, it doesn't go anywhere. But if you look at what it achieves in terms of decades, then you see the progress. And I understand that might be a bit too slow for a lot of people, but unfortunately, that is one of the many ASEAN ways that we have to live with.
Thanks very much, Thomas. Once again, you make it like Bangsa Malaysia. Everyone talks about it, but nobody knows exactly what it is, right? And you pointed it out, but you didn't tell me what it is. Just kidding. This you brought up you, of course, as I was a bit curious to see people's thoughts about that as well, and whether that's something someday in the future, what some dynamics and like that are. Thanks very much, Thomas and Alina. Cheng-Chwee, what do you think? Thoughts about ASEAN directions, successes, failures, our role in it?
So how best to assess ASEAN? I agree with what Thomas and Alina have mentioned. And let me share my points by relating to what Zokri mentioned earlier on. I think one of the key points that we all remember is the word I, right? He talked about innovation. Since he talked about one I, let me talk about three I's. So there are three I's, three words beginning with I's that I think will help us, us meaning not just Rakyat Malaysia. I would say that Rakyat Southeast Asia and also global citizen, whoever is interested in ASEAN. If I can only use three words to describe what ASEAN is, what ASEAN is not, the pro and con, the role and limitations of ASEAN, these are the three I words. So number one is imperfect. It's even inefficient, but indispensable. And you just need to bear in mind these three I's in order to know the role and also limitations of ASEAN. So you need to see them as like, it's part of the toolbox. It's not the only tool, but it is an essential tool. And precisely because of there is no tool that can like one size fit all to solve anything, right? The very issues that Thomas mentioned about the migrants issue and all that, you would assume that we should have ideally come up with like ASEAN, kita jaga kita, that kind of approach, right? But eventually in real world, it's like saya jaga saya, right? When a neighboring country will channel that direction, go to Malaysia. And many other things also. I think eventually we know that in reality, it's although we subscribe to ASEAN spirit and all that, we also need to acknowledge that at the end of the day, every country, every government would also make their own assessment. And sometimes you just couldn't blame them. And but you need to be very realistic. So when I say imperfect, inefficient, this is not like to kutuk for no reason, but it's just really a spirit of acknowledging. In the real world, you just need to accept that that's a part of the reality. But you shouldn't stop at that, and you should think about the indispensable aspect, right? But ASEAN, despite all the limitation, it's indispensable not just for all countries in Southeast Asia. Indispensable meaning what? Tak ada kita mati. If we do not have that, it means that we are going to be in big trouble. So ASEAN cannot solve all the problems, but without ASEAN, we will be in big problem, every one of us. And in fact, you could say that it's not like me like promoting ASEAN kind of indispensability, but you can look into the real world again. If ASEAN is really such like useless platform, why would big countries, big powers near and far, all willing to actually spend time and become dialogue partners? Every now and then, right? Their leaders and also foreign ministers or ministers at different level will come and attend the ASEAN-based institutions. And as we talk, you know that EU and also Canada, for example, they keep knocking on ASEAN's door, right? Can we become also a partner, right? A member of East Asia Summit and also the ADMN+. If ASEAN and ASEAN Plus mechanisms are such useless, they would not waste their time, right? So we are indispensable in the sense that, number one, it helps us to manage the intra-ASEAN problem, right? Southeast Asia, we are so diverse in so many ways. And Malaysia is the center of a territorial dispute with virtually everyone, right? We know that we didn't choose that, but we have to live with that. We can't solve it, but ASEAN provide a platform for us to interact bilaterally and sometimes unilaterally and multilaterally. So ASEAN indispensable to sort out the intra-ASEAN problem and also allow us to hang together so that we can interact with external actors, external powers who are all much bigger and stronger than us, right? We are not naive to think that ASEAN is like an alliance united. No, we do not. We are not naive. We acknowledge it's imperfect, inefficient, but we do need that to manage a lot of problems. Sorry, Annette, I think you have.
I hope you don't mind. I just want to jump in. I couldn't resist just trying to jump in with one follow-up.
You know, academic lecturer when we started, right? We have difficulty in stopping.
But speaking of, a lot of academia and and a lot of research and all that is analytical, and then obviously everything you guys have been sharing was very help us understand things better. But for the Bangsa Malaysia project, we are really also very interested in prescription, right? So if you're talking about
what should be done?
Three eyes are quite interesting, right? It's imperfect, it's inefficient, it's indispensable. Yeah. But what do you have ideas about, like again, let's say if the whole theme of the series, if you're a foreign minister, how can we improve ASEAN? How can we get a little bit more bang for our buck there, or leverage it a little bit more? What are the ways to do more? I mean, I get your point. It's even though it's not ideal, it still plays a pivotal, irreplaceable role. But yeah, what can we do to sort of make it less imperfect, less inefficient?
I think that's a great question, and believe that these are the questions everybody has been asking, right? You look into the Myanmar issue, for example, ASEAN seems to be not functioning at all, right? And I think that's in a way, it's one of the limitations that ASEAN as a regional organization that we face. But to address your question, I would think that this is something that Malaysian successive leaders, governments, and also in fact our neighboring countries have been doing something similar, is that you need to be adding layers of mechanism. If ASEAN itself cannot tackle some issues, what you need to do is that you need to have like ASEAN Plus, right? The ASEAN +1, ASEAN +3, sometimes +6 or +8. And that's one direction to add the layers. And sometimes you also need to acknowledge that if ASEAN 10 is not ready because of we have different degrees of threat perception or different degrees of problems. Your problem is not my problem, right? So you cannot angry that others are not coming in because of that is not their problem. So if that is the case, we would go not necessarily like ASEAN 10. You can have like some kind of like ASEAN minus like a minilateral mechanism. And again, I think we do have example in which some of it Malaysia actually play an active role. For example, the Malacca Strait Patrol, Eyes in the Sky. This is actually involving not all ASEAN countries, right? It only started with Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. And then Thailand joined later on to tackle the maritime piracy in Malacca Strait. And then we, in a way, repeated the similar formula, the trilateral or minilateral approach, rather than ASEAN-wide, ASEAN 10 approach in the Sulu Sea when we have the trilateral cooperative arrangement with the Philippines and also Indonesia. So these are, we can see that there are different external policy tools. They add the different layers, right? It's not either or. You don't have to, the answer in a policy world, and I think as again student of IR, I do see the rationale that it's not either or. It's not like choosing ASEAN versus others. No, you just need to have different tools. And depending on the situation, the nature of problem, and sometimes ASEAN partners might not be enthusiastic about your initiative, right? Then there is a time that you look upon and beyond ASEAN and forge your coalition accordingly. And one last example, and then I will stop, is that I think we are not just talking about all this as a 21st century issue. In fact, back in the last century, right, 1990s, when Cold War was ended, when Cold War ended, and then you would see that there are a lot of external changes and all that, there was a time that economic globalization became the most challenging external issue. And Malaysia, you can disagree with Mahathir's many policies, right? Especially domestic national policy. But externally, I do think that Mahathir has a lot of like policy that make sense and also visionary. For example, when Cold War ended and then economic globalization came to horizon, he was the first to say that, look, we need to, he didn't use the word, but that's what he meant. His answer was basically like, we need to go beyond ASEAN, right? He didn't say that, but that's what he do when he proposed the EAEG, right? East Asian Economic Grouping, that tried to enlarge the regionalism from Southeast Asia regionalism to the larger East Asian regionalism that include Northeast Asia. Tapi tak jadi, right? Because of our ASEAN fellows Indonesia, Singapore said that no, we are not interested in Malaysia version of EAEG, right? Yeah, and then big powers don't support. Japan, South Korea said, sorry, Uncle Sam does not support the idea. And if US, especially during post-colonial era, don't like the idea, tak jadi lah, kan? But then you have to wait until the Asian financial crisis. Then again, Malaysia pushed forward the ASEAN +3. And what is ASEAN +3? It's ASEAN plus 3 other countries as external layers. So I think coming back to my earlier point that we need to adjust, adapt accordingly. And that's the challenge of foreign policy for every countries, but particularly small countries like Malaysia.
Thank you very much, Cheng-Chwee. Layers and ASEAN Plus. Very good. That's very good prescription. Simple to work with. Very good, very good. Thank you very much, sir. Sorry to keep you waiting. Zokri, same, a bit of analysis, but mostly prescription. How can ASEAN do better? What are the dynamics? We're all ears, sir.
Thank you. I enjoy waiting actually and listening and learning from the rest. Now, I'll probably start like international relation is just like a world history. It works in a cycle. In the 1960s, when the EU was formed from the EEC, the European Steel Community, that we have seen that the move and the sentiments toward regionalizations in Europe booms really, really fast. And that is even mirrored to the movement and sentiment in Southeast Asia. So that's why we see that regionalizations and regionalisms triumphs quite consistently in the past. Obviously, there are some setbacks towards it. And some scholars would agree, some would not, that says that COVID-19 is actually some sort of a reversal of hyper-globalizations that we are having around, where countries began to have an inward policies to make sure that nationalism is on the rise, where people's interest is at stake. So we have seen that there is a reversal of globalizations. There was also a reversal of regionalization when COVID incepted in our daily life. But of course, I think things are catching up again, because we could not actually avoid from being connected and reconnected with our regional players. So I think the international relation, as well as ASEAN and Malaysia, works in a cycle. It depends on the external factors. It also depends on the internal factors. And I think I probably would like to relate that with the vaccine diplomacy. And I think there is a question there that asks, would ASEAN be working with the Quad? I'll try my very best to answer these questions and to relate it with the vaccine diplomacy. Now, ASEAN, though is an entity, but it has this non-interference policy, which the sovereignty of national states is something that has been protected and is out of questions. Countries or member states in ASEAN are free to join any kinds of country bilaterally or multilaterally. There's no one able to stop them. And we've seen, because of this kind of policy, the big powers or the gigantic powers are actually manipulating this kind of vacuum in ASEAN by pumping in investments and pumping in their influences as a form of soft power or as a form of smart power even. And the vaccines is actually one of the ways that big powers would like to insert their presence, their influence, as well as their aura and leadership to a particular country. And we've seen that ASEAN is quite divided with that. Cambodia is more leaning towards China. The rest of the countries are leaning towards the United States. Malaysia is actually in between. So I think it's very hard actually to gauge ASEAN's single decisions in the future, whether we'll be joining with a Quad or otherwise, because each of these countries will have its own national interests, and these big powers, big superpowers, are actually exploiting the vacuum by providing assistance, ODA, vaccines, infrastructure. We've seen that infrastructure diplomacy is also on the rise right now. Particularly in vaccine diplomacy, there's a rush or a race of big powers to supply vaccines. And for Malaysia, for instance, we've been receiving 1 million doses from the US, the Pfizer. We obviously been receiving from China, and we also been receiving from Japan, although it's AstraZeneca that is produced in Japan. So we've seen the influx of vaccines. Suddenly, all these powers come and save our country and wants to have this kind of vaccine diplomacy. Certainly, there are many interpretations towards that. And I think it's not also wrong to interpret that these are the mechanics and the ways of how that these countries insert the power into each particular country, so that each particular country will have its preference towards other countries. So it would be impossible, in my opinion, in my humble and limited opinion, for ASEAN as a whole to join or not to join the Quad. But I think we will see on how individual country makes its own decision whether or not to join the Quad. And again, probably we'll leave these questions to Dr. Quick in terms of vaccine diplomacy. Either we can categorize it as a smart power or a soft power. It's something that we have to look upon it, because it's still very, very new. It could be in between, or it could be here and there. So probably we'll stop there. And I think my point is, ASEAN works like in history. There will be a volume towards the improvement trajectory. There will be also volumes or era that we are actually going to backwards or decreasing in a way. It's an interesting moment to see.
Thank you very much, Cheng-Chwee. Yes, cycles, between nationalism, regionalism, globalism, cycles, and the external factors, of course. That's quite interesting. Thanks for reminding me. I forgot to mention there are questions. Hamid is kindly posting from Facebook, so you put them in the chat. You're welcome to address them at any time if you like. I sort of like three main questions left, and I might have to combine them. Maybe the first two, maybe combined would be easier. But of course, we want to talk about US-China. So we already started talking about vaccine diplomacy. Foreign policy in the age of COVID, like how has that been affected? How has foreign policy affected COVID? How has COVID affected foreign policy? So these are questions that I'm quite interested in. And basically the last question maybe for tonight will be about what would you do if you were foreign minister? Kind of like key policy initiatives, key changes, priorities, that sort of thing. But yeah, okay. So I mean, we live in a world of it's US and China, right? So there are views that I don't read a whole lot about this sort of stuff, but one analysis had it that China's basic view is that US is in decline, an irreversible decline of sorts, and so they've their whole sort of like global policy is meant to sort of take advantage of the fact and fill in that vacuum, as it were. So I mean, but I don't know anything about all this, and just want to hear your thoughts about that. Is this a new sort of like Cold War kind of thing, and how does Malaysia fit into all of this? In university, they love to ask this question: is the answer A or B? And the correct answer is always, well, it's a little bit of A, a little bit of B, and everyone's going to say, well, we can't be all US, we can't be all China, we've got to be a bit of both. And so that one we've heard before, but if anyone can give us maybe slightly deeper insight into how to navigate those things.
It could also be D, none of the above. Yeah, so that's always the D alternative that we have.
Yeah. Very good. Okay, we follow the same order because I'm a lazy man. Thomas, if you'd mind, if you'd be so kind, sir.
Sure. I think Elena will have a lot more to say about the US and China than I do. But can I also address the vaccine diplomacy bit, or do you want to wait for another?
Sure. No problem.
Okay. So I think I'm looking at it from the perspective of Malaysia, right? So we have major power competition bordering on adversity happening. It's not whether it's going to happen, it's already happening, and the one thing that is in the United States there is it's a very politically fractious country, but the one thing that most people agree on is that China is a strategic threat or a strategic challenge to the United States that the US needs to actively manage, and you see that transition from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. So that's a constant. The challenge for Malaysia in particular is because we are not new to major power competition. The difference is now that major power competition is happening at our doorstep. It's happening at the South China Sea, where the dispute is increasingly being subsumed into major power competition. We also straddle the Straits of Malacca, which is a very important maritime lane of communication, and as Alina alluded to earlier, there are all these decisions about which kind of what kind of tech infrastructure we're going to choose to move forward. All these have sort of strategic implications. Back when we were about to construct the high-speed rail, even that was weighted against sort of the geostrategic competition. Will we go with the Chinese system? Will we go with the Japanese system? Or will we go with the European system? Right? Or basically, will we go with the Chinese system or anything that's not that's basically not Chinese? These are the realities that we have to deal with. I think for Malaysia in particular, one thing that's very important, especially when it comes to the United States, is that, for Malaysia, and I think also for Southeast Asia, it's really important, we want engagement from the United States, but this engagement has to be predicated on engaging for Southeast Asia, not engage as for the sole bloody purpose of doing this containment of China. I mean, that's exactly how you not move forward. There is a lot of desire for the Americans to engage, but they need to do it in the right way, based on the right reasons. And even if no one is going to pretend that there is no amount of strategic competition there, but at least you need to know how to pad it up. You need to know how to wayang a little bit. You just can't. Sometimes it's just a bit too blatantly obvious, and that limits the options for us. The second bit, and I'm going to stick my neck out here, and is that ultimately for Malaysia, we might be a very flawed country, but we are also very pragmatic at the end of the day. Say what you will about policymakers, and you can say a lot about policymakers, but ultimately they're also very pragmatic people. And fundamentally, this country is a trading country. If we don't trade, we are screwed, and a large part of that trade is with China. The United States is a major trading partner, but when Malaysian policymakers see the implications of punitive trade diplomacy by China, these things ring harder to us. They sort of ring louder to us. And I think fundamentally, if we were put in a position of having to make that choice, even though we say we don't want to, we are going to go with what is more secure for us in the long term, or what will be least damaging for us in the long term, and they have different viewpoints on what that is. But I believe that ultimately, we will have to bite our tongue in certain cases and to make practical choices. On vaccine diplomacy, this is my last point. Sorry. On vaccine diplomacy, vaccine diplomacy was always going to. I mean, the moment this pandemic happened, vaccine diplomacy was and influence through vaccine was definitely going to be on the table, as is the sort of access to travel. Basically who has what vaccines and who can travel where. And it's not just something that's coming from the EU or the US. Yeah, don't forget, right up till April this year, China was going on about how to get easier entry into China for the visas to be approved, you need to have a Chinese vaccine, and then they sort of removed that little caveat in April this year. But my bigger fear, instead of vaccine diplomacy, is that we are really, hurtling headlong into an even more tiered world, where you have countries and regions that have access to vaccines and countries and regions that don't. And a lot of these countries and regions that don't already have a ton of systemic structural issues and challenges to deal with. And when things get worse, when governments lose control, this is when these challenges can overcome the sort of systemic structures in place to deal with them, and then you start seeing systemic failure. So you start seeing the ability of non-state actors to really come up and to take advantage of this and to plunge these regions even more into chaos. I mean, this is a very long-term predication of if you're going to go down that very dark rabbit hole, but don't discount it. I think what this pandemic has shown me is that when we finally have this one challenge that we all face, that we can cooperate on and work together, unfortunately, we seem to have come out short, or we seem to have come out wanting. A lot of what we could have done has been done very belatedly, and unfortunately, it doesn't really, give me the confidence for the long run. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Thomas. So you're saying COVID is exposing countries with deep structural problems, and in places like that, non-state actors are taking over.
Sure. I think
talking about us, right? Talking about Malaysia, right?
Well, Malaysia and the region at large. I think that the biggest, the biggest time, people say, a lot of people say COVID has brought about challenges. True, it has, but what it has done even more is it has really ripped open the band-aid on existing challenges that were barely being held together, right? So when the system is upended and everything goes to chaos, you see that a lot of the problems you're facing now were most of them were just there pre-COVID. It's just that now they sort of ripped open the band-aid and we're trying to paper over the cracks. That's about it.
It didn't break the system, it exposed the broken system. Thank you very much, Thomas. Some good insights. Okay, I think we've tried to promise someone we finish by 10. We're going to try our best here. So yeah, US, China, right? Also, there are a lot of things, one belt, one road. I mean, of course, I studied in the States. I'm a little bit left-leaning myself, so I sometimes find China a bit scary. Is that a reasonable fear? Is that bias on my part? There's things like Xinjiang and all that sort of thing. Elena, some insights.
That is someone who's also studied in the US and lives in the US now, also a bit left-leaning on political issues. I mean, let me push this back to you a little. Wouldn't you lean a little more center? Because the US does have an imperial past as well. So to frame the context, I guess. So let me address your 3 questions and try to also address some of the questions in the chat that have come up on Facebook, I guess, along the way.
The minister one, we can save for one more last round. I think we can squeeze that in. We can save that one. Please go ahead with the rest. Yeah.
Okay. So let me start with vaccine diplomacy, right? And I think this pandemic has really been a missed opportunity for global cooperation, if not at the very least coordination between and among the major powers. And instead, what you've seen is this rivalry, this competition for influence and leverage through vaccine diplomacy. You've seen nationalism rear its ugly head in many major powers. And now you see this race, as many others have said, to showcase their vaccine power, whether it's overtly or a little more subtly. And you've heard rhetoric like, oh, well, our vaccines are better and they've proven to be more efficient, or our vaccines come with no strings attached, but we were first to provide vaccines. And all this competitive rhetoric for what? How has it really improved global public health? We saw during the pandemic that there was a lack of leadership. There was this vacuum from amongst the major powers that we've so often turned to for any crisis in the world. And I think this pandemic has really underscored the agency, again, of smaller states. You saw, for example, countries in the region like Singapore and Brunei being one of the first to sign on to COVAX, contributing to COVAX. And I think this showcases the fact that perhaps we should stop waiting for and looking to the major powers to determine our future, and really unshackle ourselves from this thought that we need to be reactive and rather take the initiative ourselves. Another example of our reaction, this whole reframing of the Indo-Pacific, you might have heard, right? We used to call our region the Asia-Pacific. Well, along comes a major power and reframes it to the Indo-Pacific for various reasons. Amongst them, this idea of combining the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, because the maritime sphere is so important for strategic reasons. So what did ASEAN do? ASEAN came up with an ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific without explicitly, setting aside or acknowledging the fact that there is now this nomenclature of the Indo-Pacific. In the document, if you go through it, it's a relatively short document, under 20 pages, I think. It refers to both the Indo-Pacific and the Asia-Pacific. And I think this is the balancing act that smaller states in our region play. that we accept that there are going to be larger countries that are going to try to shape our destinies no matter what, even by changing the name of our region. But that we also have agency to try to push back a little in, our soft, gentle way, because we don't want to offend anyone. So I think this whole US-China rivalry will continue to shape our future in the immediate term, in the next 5 to 10 years. Unfortunately, what it will also do is that it will set the trajectory for the long term. And here, I go back to your point, Nat, about infrastructure, not only physical infrastructure, but also digital infrastructure. Because the investments that we make today are going to determine how we navigate these precarious relationships in the future. If, as in the case of Malaysia and our procurement of weapon systems, for example, we choose to mix and match systems, if the rivalry between the US and China deepens, where does that leave us in the next 10 to 20 years? If there are cyber attacks by different countries against each other for whatever reason, and we're caught in the middle, how will that affect a multi-country regional project like the ASEAN power grid? And energy is a critical infrastructure. So if different countries are buying from different powers, and it's their right to do so, then these considerations need to be factored into the implications of how they will impact us in the future. So I'll save my recommendation for the last round.
Thank you very much. We are looking for the recommendation because you've painted a very pertinent, interesting problem. Multi-systems, you either buy from the left or you buy from the right, or you buy from a bit of both. But if you buy from a bit of both, then things get funny, then it gets quite complex. But yeah, as you said, yeah, most interested in prescriptions. So hopefully last one you tell us exactly what we need to do, but I don't know what to do. I just realized you're talking about, we shouldn't rely on big powers, we rely on ourselves. It sounds a lot like Project Bangsa Malaysia. This is what we do on a domestic scale. No more relying on politicians. We all just do everything ourselves. That's why we are here talking to you. But also, I couldn't resist really quickly. We're talking about US and China and trying to get the best deal from both. I watched this excellent Netflix movie. Now my favorite Tamil movie, becoming one of my favorite movies of all time. It's called Mandela. You must watch this movie. It'll teach you everything you need to know about politics and international relations, I think. Okay, sorry, Cheng-Chwee, your take on this gajah bertempur, kancil di tengah-tengah. How should we deal with this? What's the best way? Prescription. Thank you, sir. Silakan.
Thomas and Zokri, I know what's the word that I have in mind, but I won't say it. I would talk about it in different ways. I have 3 questions. I have 3 points, but those 3 points are not necessarily like responding each of your questions, but to address them in overall, and also hopefully to relate to the questions.
Maybe one extra question also. You said you've been studying this for 25 years. Maybe you can give us some historical perspective of this trajectory. But please go on. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Well, history is a dangerous word, right? It might not go back to 25 years, but 250 years. But we can talk about that. Certainly, it's part of my first point. So my first point is about DNA, right? Not biological DNA, but it's about political DNA of big powers. What we are seeing about US-China rivalry and all that is not new. I agree with Thomas earlier on, right? Malaysia and Southeast Asia do not feel big power politics, US-China rivalry as something new. It's a part of our history. And that has a lot to do with big power DNA. It is in the DNA of all big powers, past and present and future, to compete, to exercise their newly acquired strength versus the others. So the zero sum, the competition, even the conflictual will be part and parcel of the process. So we just have to face it. And I think today, and still on the first point about the DNA of a big power, is that it's mainly about US and China. But along the process, as what Elena mentioned earlier on by talking about Quad and Indo-Pacific, is also a part of the question there, is that we are not just seeing US and China rivalry, but we are seeing different layers of big power competition. At the top is US and China, but also China and many other US allies and partners here in Asia and also Europe. So you see a Quad, US, Japan, Australia, and also India. But you're also seeing EU countries either individually or as a group. They are also pivoting more and more to our part of the world with ASEAN as a center of courtship. So that's point number 1. It's nothing new. It's part of the big power DNA to compete. And we can't say that we don't like it or we like it, but we have to accept it and we have to adjust, adapt accordingly, which brings me to my second point. My second point is that, but what is new to the contemporary big power competition at different levels, US and China primarily, is they are not just competing on the high politics military chessboard, but also non-military chessboard, thing that Zulkifli mentioned earlier on. Infrastructure, connectivity, physical, digital are just part and parcel. With the COVID, you're also seeing that they're competing on the so-called pandemic diplomacy, vaccine diplomacy and all that. So all of this is not necessarily that they are altruism, right? They care about Southeast Asia or Malaysia, but they are competing among themselves, and the byproduct is what we are seeing along this military and also non-military. So this again, it's I would say something new. And just like the first point, there are good aspects, there are negative aspects, which brings me to my third and also my final point. I know you like the prescription, right? So what should be done to accept the realities of a big power competition, and also they're competing on a military and non-military chessboard. I think my prescription is that we need policymakers have to have two things in mind, right? One is why not? The other one is what if, right? We need to have it hand in hand. Why not will mean that you need to be, Malaysians like to say pandai-pandai, right? You need to pandai by judging, right? On a certain non-military, on certain military aspect, you need to be very careful. You do not want to be entrapped into the gajah fighting, and then you don't want to be entrapped. Those things that have to be cautious, which I would argue that Malaysia and other ASEAN countries would not join a Quad. We would not even be part of the Quad Plus. Very, very unlikely we would go into that unless and until China go even more aggressive, undermining and threatening everybody. Short of that, I don't think ASEAN countries or Malaysia would go into a Quad or even a Quad Plus. But why not would means that, but on some other non-sensitive or less sensitive issues, on vaccine, on infrastructure, I think our answer would be why not, and the more the merrier, right? We need to diversify. And we need to diversify in the way that we are strengthening our strategic and development links with as many powers and players as possible, so that you have an alternative, so that you have a space to maneuver. And but if we only have why not the mentality, that will be very dangerous. You need to have a what if. You need to have the what if mindset of what if the US-China rivalry escalate into a direct conflict? What if the Quad become anti-China containment? What if China become even more aggressive? What if certain powers retreat us the way they retreated from Southeast Asia in the 1960s? So all this what if situation will pose some risk, and that's what Elena mentioned earlier on, right? We do not, we shouldn't just think about benefits. Benefits are good things. We need to think about the risks and also the uncertainties. So the what if mentality should guide our policy choices. It's not a clear-cut either or, but we need to use this mindset of why not and what if in assessing and also adapting our external approaches accordingly as external conditions, external environment become more and more competitive and more uncertain.
Thank you very much, Cheng-Chwee. Why not and what if? It's very good, very good. Cover all your bases. Think carefully, slowly. Yeah,
and the one word will be hedging, right?
Yeah.
And hedging means insurance policy.
Yeah.
I would always be risky.
In my line of work, I don't particularly like people who hedge too much, but yeah, in this line of work, I understand.
Oh, Nat, why you personally attack quick like that?
I just sometimes my line of work, if people hedge too much means they are neither here nor there, no principle. But it's a different, totally different.
Can I have a quick response? Sure. I think most people, this is not the first time I think kind of I hear people say we don't like hedging, right? But my response has always been, this is mainly because of our misunderstanding about the term hedging. It has a lot of connotation, but in reality, hedging is what everybody is doing. Hedging means insurance. And do you hate insurance? No, you don't hate insurance. You hate the consequences if you don't insure in any way. And that's pending is all about.
It's totally different context lah. On a global level, I think it's definitely logic to that, very logical. Okay, sorry, so again, keep you waiting. So for Zokri, I think we, as per his request, we'll combine the questions just in case you need to leave at 10. Sorry, we didn't finish everyone in time, but we need to leave early, it's no problem lah. But okay, yes. So again, US, China, COVID, and foreign policy, and then for you, also sometimes for the last question, I like to reverse. So you don't the whole night, same person be first, you feel bad a bit. So we just go the other way around. We'll go backwards for the last question. So for Zokri, you can just combine lah. Go ahead, please.
Okay, I'll make it short and brief in the interest of time. Now, first and foremost, the US-China relations. Now, the US-China rivalry is about to stay. It is definitely staying. There's no way that we can harmonize between these two. Yeah, it is very natural and very organic. However, this is what I like about Kishore Mahbubani's book, Has China Won? Now, in his book, he framed the right questions as how we question the US-China rivalry onto our own benefit. So framing the right questions has always been a good practice in understanding a state behavior. Does US-China relations or rivalry is something bad for Malaysia? Does it really bring anything good for Malaysia? So again, I would not go on to all of these questions, but in approaching US-China rivalry, we really need as Malaysia to ask the right, to frame the right questions so that we will get the right prescriptions. Yeah, and just a very quick one to Nat. I mean, because obviously you're leaning towards the West, but I think Razak Baginda wrote a very good book entitled Dragon Diplomacy, in which he evaluated this China's behavior and China's rise. Very, very, very independent and very neutral in a way. I think that's something a really good book for us to read, because in that sense that we can understand what are the ramifications and the implications to us as Malaysia when it comes to the dragon's diplomacy. And he goes on to the narratives of what a dragon is, how we can understand dragon as a benevolent behavior and whatnot. And I remember having a conversation with Raza. And this was at BSC, because when he launched the book, I met him, just got his signature, and then I dragged him to BSC. I think it was a Coffee Bean that time. Sorry, I think during this COVID, we tried to throw back all the places that we've been to, where we go for vacation. So I just want to take that opportunity as well. I've been to BSC, Coffee Bean on the ground floor, having a discussion with Raza on his book. And then I asked him, so what do we do? How does Malaysia react to it? And again, I think his answers and my response is quite similar. And I would like to be very consistent with my argument on the first question that you asked, Nat, is that however that we respond to this US-China rivalry goes back to our visions. How do we envision ourselves? Where do we position ourselves in the future? And then we bring along all of this geopolitics and geoeconomics complexity into our turf. Yeah. And again, I would also like to pick up what Alina has said. Do not too obsessed with this big powers and these gigantic superpowers competitions, not to rely on them, but build the inner strength, build our own compass, our own directions. And then we try to utilize whatever that happens in surroundings. So that's would be my take on the US-China relations. Now, on to the questions. What would I be if I become the foreign minister, or what will I do when I become the foreign minister? The four things. The first one is very serious note. Yeah, this is very serious. Please take it very seriously. I would appoint Dr. Quick, Alina, and Thomas to be my pegawai khas, to be my special advisor for foreign policy, for Malaysian foreign policy. And this is something really serious. I'll get the offer letter done on the first day I got into the office. Now, secondly,
we're recording, just so you know.
Yes, please record that, and you'll bring it out when I've been appointed as the foreign minister. Now, secondly, I think right now at the moment, in the short term, I will definitely have to respond to Bloomberg's report that says that we are actually going towards a failed state. I think not only that is quite unfair, but I think as Malaysians, again, I'm putting myself as a future foreign minister is that this is the moment that Malaysians should rally to defend the image and reputation of our country. I really admit that the country is not perfect. We have so many things to fix, but we are not going onto the failed state. Yeah, there are a lot of challenges and we are willing to fix it. And I think Project Bangsa Malaysia is one of the ways to fix things up. So do not let our sentiments to be drawn into all this unfair, one-sided report that's trying to derail ourselves from our attention. So I would definitely defend and write an article. I will join Tengku Zafar to write another analysis and another evaluations on why Malaysia is not actually going into the failed state. And I think that's a national duty. And Elena, please come back and serve the nations if I call you to be my advisor. Right. Thirdly, we have to make diplomacy and international relation awareness in the country, or in a normal word, we say we need to merakyatkan diplomasi. Ya, apa-apa saja yang berkaitan dengan diplomasi, hubungan luar negara harus menjadi topik perbincangan rakyat. Jadi bahasa yang digunakan, nuansa yang digunakan adalah bahasa-bahasa yang mudah. We do not want foreign policy to be the discussions of the elite, to be the discussion of the scholars, but we want the awareness and we want the knowledge of foreign policy to also be discussed generally to all Malaysians in all levels of our society. Therefore, we will have the awareness how Malaysia should move forward as a country in the international sphere. Now, the fourth one, this is going to be my last point. I would probably rally to make Malaysia as a middle power. Now, at the moment, we're probably not in a soft, hard, smart, but I think it's fine. We have to start somewhere. I would definitely work hard to make sure that we are on the right track to be a middle power. And what I will be looking at, I'm not going to be very ambitious. What I'll be looking at is to increase the competitiveness of our country, as well as the capabilities and the capacity. Once we build these three pillars, capacity, capabilities, and competitiveness, then Malaysia would just go anywhere that it wants to go. We are not ambitious. We are just not saying that we want to be champion of ASEAN or the leaders or anything, but this is manifested if we're able to build a competitiveness, capacity, as well as capability in the nations. So thank you very much, Nat and Project Bangsa Malaysia. It's been a very pleasure and honor actually to address to all of you tonight. So yep, going to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Cheng-Chwee. That's very kind. Good. Four solid points. Middle power, definitely support that. You mentioned failed state. Actually, I wrote an article about that. I studied stuff like this. I spent some time in Sierra Leone. I studied post-Cold War conflicts in Africa and things like that. Yeah, so of course, by most technical definitions, I think we agree it's not a failed state. But just for me personally, I can't help feeling, reading all the stories about the hospitals now and things like that. May not technically be a failed state, but at some point, not far down the road, if they don't do something drastic, it's not going to make much difference what you call it or not. but I understand your sentiments definitely. And it's of course very nice to say about the pegawai hosting, but I'm also a big believer in this. Of course tonight we need kalau rakyat jadi menteri kind of singular, but I think in the longer term, we definitely need one more group think lah. I mean, not in a bad way, but we want to bring more brains to the table rather than all just be one person kind of thing. Thank you so much. Again, if you have to go, it's 10 o'clock. We'll miss you. But thank you so much for taking your time to be with us. Okay, it's really great to make the connection. Enjoyed hearing your views. And yeah, kita nak merayakan demokrasi. Sokong. Thanks very much, boss. Okay, so we're going backwards. Now next foreign minister, Mr. Cheng-Chwee, dipersilakan. Your vision, your plans, your priorities.
I really want to let Elena and Thomas to talk more. So let me be very quick by saying that as Rakyat Malaysia, with what is going on in our country, I would say that point number one is to get our house in order. Otherwise, whatever initiative, vision, direction, again, to quote something that Malaysians like to talk about is that itu semua tu syok sendiri. And if we cannot get our house in order, the current political mess and uncertainties, we are losing all the opportunities and we are seeing risks without realizing the danger. And we are actually, in terms of timing, we are at the unprecedented historical juncture at so many levels. And other countries are positioning themselves so well, but we are so preoccupied with our own internal mess. And I think I will stop here. And
Thanks.
good
I'm
luck,
sure,
Malaysia.
I'm sure you could have more. You sure you don't want to add in a little bit more? You've been doing this
It will
for
take another 2 hours. I better not.
but of course, I mean, can't argue with you about domestic mess. Yeah, I honestly, I don't follow international relations so much because I'm preoccupied with domestic mess, and I can see the logic in that until we get our house in order. What we want to talk about. But you also bring up an important point. Another that I haven't thought about much is that one reason we want to rush to get our house in order because, as you say, maybe this is a time of great opportunity. When people are competing for your votes, it's a good time to be in the game, and we're not in the game, so that's something.
You can have 1 more minute since what you mentioned, and then Zokri mentioned about middle powership, right? Let me just make one kind of clarification on the basis of what Zokri mentioned. In fact, a few years ago, Wisma Putra did have a project called Middle Power Project. In fact, Datuk Suda was the one who was the head of the project, and then engaging some academic researchers on that particular issue. What is the status? I do not know. And then, let's be practical as a student of IR, not policy people, not the minister and politician or whatever. As a Rakyat Malaysia who happen to study IR, I do think that middle powership is a good thing, it's a good vision, because of it actually allow a country to actually maximize our potential, look into our comparative advantage. We are a smaller country, but it doesn't mean that we're a powerless country, right? And Malaysia in history has always been a middle power in a real term, in the sense that we are middle power, undeclared one, but depending on how you define a middle power, if by any middle power, it means that you are someone who are not just following, but you are throwing out some initiative that have an impact that is being institutionalized. You do think that Malaysia has been a middle power for a long time during the Cold War period and also the post-Cold War era, but we are losing a momentum because of the domestic issues that we are challenging. So 3 eyes, another 3 set of eyes to characterize the middle powership. If we are managed to get our house in order, we do need some kind of middle powership that entails initiative with impacts, and impacts that can be institutionalized, meaning that we will continue to do this together with our partners within ASEAN region and also externally. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thanks very much, sir. Yeah, middle power. I mean, I'm a big believer in the potential of Malaysia, Malaysians. So I know it sounds like a very distant dream, but if we could one day be some sort of at least a moral authority, that would be cool. I think that's not beyond us. But yeah, all papers on whether we can get domestic house in order. Thank you, sir. Okay, Elena, you are up.
All right, let me give you some reactions and recommendations. There was a question in the chat about TPP and the US. At this point in time, there is no appetite to pursue the TPP or the CPTPP in its current form in the same way that the US did before. So that ship has sailed. There's no domestic buy-in in the US. What there is some initial support for right now is perhaps a sectoral approach to the TPP. And one of the sectors that's being paid attention to is digital trade. And herein lies my recommendation, that Wisma Putra appoint an ambassador for strategic tech issues. And this would cover the intersection of foreign policy, of digital trade, as well as emerging technologies. So not your usual siloed approach, but someone who can rise above these issues and tie them together, because that's where we're heading as a global nation, as a globe. There are all these different components that are playing into tech right now, and there's no way that we can take this very stovepiped approach to handling tech issues. We can't just be thinking about economy without thinking about the security implications. We cannot be thinking about tech as separate from foreign policy in how we conduct diplomacy. So appoint an ambassador for strategic tech issues. Secondly, I think that it starts with us, right? Nat, it starts with the Rakyat. And part of that is educating and re-educating ourselves. Now, I have been a student of world affairs, of international law for a number of years. I won't say how long, but pretty long, because I feel really old. But the point is this, it took me the George Floyd murders and the protests around the US to realize that I know very little about my own region and our history and the very dark past of our history that we need to confront and arise out of. So someone who studied in the West, I think many of us have studied in the West, if not all of us, we tend to absorb these ideas of IR theories, you know, we talk about realism, neorealism, constructivism, and all that. Those are only a few schools of thought. They do not shape international relations. They do because we allow them to, and because those are the only schools of thought we are so widely exposed to. I've been a student of international law, as I said, for a number of years. I did not realize there was a third world approach to international law until a few years ago. And this opened up a whole world to me that I was not even aware of, that made so much sense to me beyond what I was grappling with. And I have papers from grad school to prove that I did not resonate, or all these theories did not resonate with me. And so if there is something missing, it's in our education. And this goes back to Cheng-Chwee's point about getting our house in order. And then I will finally agree with Zuhri about merakyatkan foreign policy ideas. I do think that democratizing of these ideas that Wisma was starting to do under the Pakatan Harapan government has to be based on very sound knowledge of our own histories and our own context, not ideas that we've blindly accepted without criticizing or critiquing in a thoughtful and constructive manner. So I would just say, think, rethink, learn, and unlearn in order to relearn.
Thank you very much. Think, rethink, learn, unlearn. Very, very good. I also like your ambassador idea. You're right. You know, these things are very deeply connected now. Foreign policy, tech, and economy. It's all just really one big thing now. So that's good. Third world approaches to international law, also very interesting. Of course, you know, we like our bottom-up stuff and getting our house in order. That's for sure. Very good, Elena. Thank you. I hope to see you with Wisma Putra one day. Thank you very much. And first shall be last and last shall be first. Mr. Thomason.
Thanks. And I'm going to take the easy way out and just build up on what the previous speakers have said, right? So, you know, I think Elena's point of having a tech and a cyber ambassador is extremely important. This is the issues that are being, you know, the rules and the norms are being shaped right now, and we need to be there at the table while they're being shaped so that we can contribute to these rules being made, these rules and these discussions and these norms being made, and not just becoming rule takers. You know, Malaysia moves very, very fast when it comes to issues of free trade. We are always there at the table to discuss. Sometimes even at the even when we sacrifice a significant political capital to do so. That's what Najib did with the TPPA. When these discussions on cyber and tech is happening, we need to be there. I think this is something that my colleagues at ISIS, and I think Alina, when she was at ISIS, used to push Wisma Putra on. That there is some parallel to this. You know, Wisma Putra currently has a maritime department, which is an extremely important department in Wisma, especially when it comes to the South China Sea and our disputes on maritime disputes with our neighbors. But it was never a department for a very long time. You know, the team that looked at this used to be a part of the used to be part of multilateral, I think, but now it's a department by itself and a very important one. So I think we need to get a move on cyber. And the most important thing is that there are friendly countries out there who have a lot of experience with this, who are willing to help Malaysia to move towards that direction. I think we should take advantage of it. Unfortunately, I don't think the sort of policymakers see it that way, and you know, and unfortunately, in the very Malaysian way, we are going to have to play catch up eventually if we continue down this path. The second thing is, let me build up on what Prof. Quick and Dr. Zokri said much earlier on, which is basically, you've got the sort of multiple architectures that underpin the way our world works and functions is undergoing tremendous stresses and changes. And this is precisely the moment where if we can leverage our strengths we can achieve strategic impact for ourselves. But to do that, we first need to really understand who we are. And it's not a very simple statement, reflecting on who we are is a stepping stone to identifying what we can bring to the table. So these are like, questions like, what is our international identity? What do we stand for? What are the themes that we need to, or what is the image that we want to project about Malaysia and how we conduct ourselves internationally? And how do we bring these different identities to strengthen our role? A conscious and deliberate attempt to project this set of well-defined identities will lead to a more, hopefully will lead to a more coherent conduct of our foreign policy and as an identification of Malaysia as a partner of choice in these key areas. But it's also important to be very selective in doing so. Having a laundry list of identities will only lead to a diffusion of effort. We cannot be everything to anyone, and we cannot and should not attempt to do everything. Unfortunately, in Malaysia, I think we have always tripped over ourselves in trying to do too many things rather than trying to do some things well. And I think this is one of the fundamental foreign policy problems of when Dr. Mahathir was Prime Minister. Yes, he achieved a lot, but I think we tried to do too many things, and as a result, we ended up doing too many things as opposed to doing a few things really, really well. But this is just my personal view. So having this clear understanding and starting a national conversation on who we are, what we want to be, what we want to identify ourselves as, and what we want to move forward to is something that I think it's time for that national conversation. It's problematic as it is to have this national conversation among different government agencies, because everyone works in silos. There's going to be an entire rehash of this, this pitched knife fights that always happen. But at the same time, it's still a conversation that is important and that's worth having. And the longer we delay, we sort of just continue down the sort of middling path, and unfortunately, we will pay a price for that.
Thank you, Thomas. So the first thing you mentioned was about learning from others a little bit. You talked about the, in terms of what we're doing in foreign policy, maritime affairs, and things like that. There's a lot you can learn from other countries, and we shouldn't be arrogant about this. If the people know how to do, they're willing to teach, we should learn. I think that's very wise and good. You talk about having national conversations. Thomas, we are in one now, as it happens. So this is what we're trying to do with the Siri Dialog Bangsa Malaysia. This is our 15th, and yeah, we're slowly it's a very difficult process, and we don't have harbor illusions about how we're doing, but we're trying at least have a microcosm of stuff. But you're exactly right, and we're in a series of conversations, exactly as you say, trying to figure out who we are. And what we can do both nationally, internationally, things like that. So of course we're happy to hear this kind of comments. I think it drives what we're trying to do. Very good. Thank you so much. It's 10:20 almost, guys. What a fascinating conversation it's been. I hope people like you will have a lot more input into the future of our foreign policy. You guys have given a lot of insight, wise, considered, and thinking insights. Again, not bogged down by politics, not bogged down by commercial interest or self-interest, worst of all. And it's been very helpful. We'll keep this for the record. Hopefully, be able to transcribe some of these things, and most of all, of course, hopefully, as Thomas says, ongoing conversation. We hope to keep talking and keep learning from people like you. Okay, so sorry, we better not drag on too long, but thank you so much. Any closing remarks or any last things anybody want to say? Okay, for now. Thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate it. Thank you everyone on Facebook who's been listening to us and who's watching us in the future. We really appreciate it. Stay tuned. Hopefully we'll have more of these conversations as time comes. This is probably wrap up our first round of Siri Dialog Bangsa Malaysia. You guys have the final climax of our series, first round at least, and hopefully there'll be more rounds to come. If we can fix our hospitals and get through this COVID thing first. But thank you so much, guys. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Have a good night. Good morning, Alina. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Take care. Thank you. Good night. Okay, let me turn off the Facebook stream.